be talking about right now and then and continuing are the threats and opportunities, both at the national level and also at the state level. And this segues into what all we can do to address some of those threats. So I'm going to also invite others in the room who might want to add to my list, but I'm going to start out with the threats. And I'm going to move to the opportunities. And as I'm talking about the threats, understand that sometimes the threats are also opportunities. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. So the recent Supreme Court decisions indicate that we have a threat. Would people agree?
Yes.
Yes. Would people like to? What kind of threat does that present?
Rights being taken away.
Rights being taken away. That's a very, very succinct way to say it. Yes. So that can be seen as a threat. There are vacancies on the bench. The one that we're seeing right now that's most notable is at the Supreme Court level, but here in Ohio, you also have some vacancies on the court, which we'll talk about more. Namely, 2 circuit court vacancies.
Yeah, two Sixth Circuit court vacancies that have been nominated by the president. 2 attorneys that come from Ohio. I was on a phone call just yesterday with Sherry Brown's office, and he is very much opposed to these folks because of their very far out of tune views on a number of the issues that we all care about. So it's not just the fact that we have vacancies, but who's being filled in those vacancies.
Texas and North Carolina are the same voters
Yes.
as ones in Ohio.
And I'll talk about those too as both threats and opportunities. We have, particularly since Citizens United, but really all along, an influx of money in politics that's completely not transparent and unregulated, and is getting worse and worse. And that will be covered, I think, in great detail a little bit later. And the states that are most being impacted by that are states that have judicial elections, because that's where the money shows up, or that's where it doesn't show up, but it's actually happening anyway. We have a number of really interesting strategies that legislatures and governors have been trying all over the country. And I'll go through some of these, and there may be additions to that. In some states, North Carolina being probably the most visible one right now, one way to actually change the bench is through redistricting. Anybody heard of that strategy before? And who do you think might lose if that actually happens?
Minorities.
Minorities. Yes, exactly. We've got term limiting. So if you sense that there are some judges on the bench that are making impartial decisions that might actually maintain people's rights, particularly as it concerns, say, reproductive choice, and they're older, then one way to actually make that judge disappear is to basically do term limits, or to say, oh, judges can no longer be over the age of X, and then poof, judge disappears. There are strategies to defund the judiciary. This is, who's heard of that strategy before? Defunding of government.
Kansas, right?
Yes. Well, Kansas particularly, but our whole government has been suffering from that strategy, I think, for a number of years now, when one of our presidents discovered that if he dismantled the government from the inside out, then people would no longer want it. Does that sound? Yeah. So that's a strategy. Negative campaigning, particularly when judges have taken or had a case that's been prominent that might involve being soft on crime. And who do we think the defendant might have been in those cases? What race?
Black men.
Yeah, of course, right? Or if the judge has made a decision in a case that actually maintains reproductive rights. Those judges are particularly targeted for negative campaigning and also tend to disappear very quickly. Another category of threat is our lack of knowledge, our general lack of knowledge in this country, at the state level too, about the judiciary. And the fact that, as people have mentioned, where we do have elections, people show up and don't vote mostly because they don't know enough about the candidates. And they're also, it's hard to discover where the candidates are on some ballots. Maybe they're on the back side or, small print. So that's also a threat. There's a general contempt for the rule of law in this country right now. What are some of the signs of that? It's not coming from us. Who's it coming from?
The chief executive of the country.
That presents a problem for us, right? And for folks that really wanted to really feel contempt for the rule of law anyway, what does it give those folks?
A license.
A license.
Yes.
They've got a license.
Yes.
Those are the threats that come to mind right now. There may be others, but let's move to opportunities for just a minute. Think about if there are other threats, then we'll go over those too. So one opportunity, which is on the other side of a threat, is there's an opportunity right now nationally with the vacancy that we're having on the Supreme Court for a national conversation about what kind of justice we need, what kind of justice system we need, who we need on the bench, and what kind of systems we need to get those folks on the bench. And this is an interesting moment because last year at about this time, we were scratching our heads about how to initiate the discussion about why the courts matter, right? Right now, I think it's pretty clear to a lot of people, not just the people in this room, why the courts matter, right? Am I right?
Yes.
And it's actually a good thing to be having one conversation. It's probably the most unifying thing that I can think of that might happen in the country, right? Over the next 6 months is this conversation. So I'm looking forward to that. There's also a number of different campaigns and states that I want to talk about briefly. So this is some of the work that's been done in the states by organizations and people like you in the recent past. So in Kansas, last year they were attacked in every which way, trying to dismantle the judiciary. There were 5 justices that were up for retention election, and there were negative attack ads. There were all kinds of different attacks on these justices. And the organization that's your sister organization in Kansas managed to do a gigantic public education campaign involving retired judges and former judges, and all of them were retained against all odds. There was so much money spent. It was incredible. So that was the Kansas experience last year. In Wisconsin right now, there's a huge campaign to make sure that judges recuse themselves when they're getting money from special interests and they're actually deciding on those decisions. And very recently, over the last 6 months or so, maybe even going back a year, again, retired judges got involved in this and started having public hearings all over the state about recusal, because recusal rules come from the judiciary. And it turned out that 2 months ago, that became the defining issue in the election for a Supreme Court seat. It became the defining issue, so they actually made that the issue that people were looking at, and the judge that was for recusal actually won. And that campaign continues, but people are winning right now in Wisconsin. Folks in West Virginia just narrowly, but won a victory that prevented their state legislature from taking over the entire judiciary budget. So when that happens, if the judges make a decision that the legislature doesn't like, the next day they don't have money to repair the roof. And our folks in West Virginia prevented that from happening in the span of about 4 days by creating agreement across both Democrats and Republicans in the legislature not to do that, unless they had a supermajority, and then they could actually tamper with the budget, but only a little bit. So that was huge. In Pennsylvania, they just fought back an attempt to impeach judges. So if the judges aren't making the right decision, let's impeach them. And they successfully won that. In Florida, they almost got, almost very narrowly by one vote, they almost were able to change their state constitution to have diversity criteria in the state constitution to make sure that the commission that selected the judges was diverse by our standards here in this room, narrowly by just one vote, missed having that in the state constitution. So those are just some examples of things that are happening all over the country, and I'm not deliberately avoiding the losses. I'm actually telling you what is actually going on right now. And I'm not going to lie to you. What's happening is the forces of good and the forces of evil, we're right at the critical juncture. If you look at North Carolina, there's good news one day, potentially bad news the next day, and our folks are holding the line, but that's where we are right now. And so that's something to watch. So another opportunity that we have here in this room, and then I'll close, is that heading toward this election, and also with reference to the vacancy on the Supreme Court, the issues that we want to talk about and the solutions that we want to talk about are going to be very much in the public eye. There's going to be talk about money in politics. There's going to be talk about filling vacancies, about justice, and it's always easier and better for us when we're able to actually use those openings for the organizing that we're doing. And over the last year or two, people are really thinking about rights in a different way. Black Lives Matter exists. Civil rights are on people's minds from all kinds of different perspectives, and I think that's also going to give us some momentum. So that's my my synopsis. Folks might have some things to add to this that I haven't covered.
So the question is, as you were thinking about threats and opportunities, were there things that you wanted to add to the conversation? And we may put it on, as we talk about this, we may be thinking about this for another meeting. Anything we're missing? Hello.
Yes, I'm excited about the opportunity that we have to awaken people from their sleep. From the apathy and the complacency and the lethargy, from the fatigue that drives people to the point where they do not participate and act as if they don't care. We have an opportunity to awaken them. And once we get them galvanized, and once we get them energized and excited, then they can get engaged. That's what I'm excited about, because that's going to happen. And you see it happening across the country. We're going to do it here in Ohio. We're going to do it in Dayton. People are going to wake up. We're going to get people excited. People are going to find out about judicial reform. They're going to find out about candidates, and they're going to do their homework, and they're going to get excited because they're going to be a part of the process. Amen.
Amen.
I was going to say he's making me more excited. So the way that this portion of the discussion is set up is that we're going to watch a video from Wisconsin, which will kind of key up a conversation about what the problem is. Jessica Dickinson, who's from Kamikaze, Ohio, she's one of our wonderful volunteers, is going to kind of lay out some of the money in politics stuff that we know about, kind of in the back of our head, but might want a little bit more information. And then Trent's going to go over some recusal information, like, well, what are some options? Like, let's think about, like, if we have an idea of the problem, what are some possible solutions? And then at the end, Louise is going to walk us through some ways that we could get involved. Because nothing is worse than going to a meeting and getting all this information and going home and be like, okay, what do I do about all this?
That's right.
So this is actually from Wisconsin Common Cause, and it's about judicial recusal. And I just thought it was a really good way to get it. How do I do this? Next one over. Yeah, thank you. There you go.
So I'm acting mature party in the courtroom. You find out after you've lost your case that the judge was cousins with one of the parties that was litigating against you, the winning party. That would obviously concern you.
When you walk in the courtroom and you take a look and you know that, or your lawyer knows that, you suddenly don't feel very confident that he's going to listen to you.
You lost your case, and then you found out that your opponent had given me $10,000, had given me $100,000, had given me $1 million in a campaign prior to the decision. You might question whether I was truly unbiased and impartial. Basically, we're talking about the role of a judge in deciding whether a judge should stay on or off the case based on various outside pressures or connections that may impact the judge's fairness or impartiality. In Wisconsin, currently, the person who determines whether or not a judge should stay on the case or get off the case is the judge, him or herself. If you don't have the power of judicial review over that determination, it means that the person who is making the decision on whether they're fair and biased is the same person who has been challenged as not being fair and biased. It's kind of like saying, I'm not a crook, and then being the final say.
Judicial races, the Supreme Court races, have become very high money races. There are millions of dollars being spent not only by the candidates, but more importantly, I think, by the advocacy groups, the third-party special interest group. And the perception is every time they vote consistently with a group that has contributed money to their campaign or helped them get elected, people question the impartiality of that decision.
Yes.
It's giving a sense to the public, and lots of people in the public, that the justice is for sale.
No one cares about a judge until they're standing in front of them. And when they do have to stand in front of a judge, what they really want is a judge that agrees with them, as opposed to a judge that's fair and impartial. But if they can't have that, the next best thing is a fair judge. And the system only works if you have a fair judge, a judge who can look at the facts, look at the law, be neutral, be impartial, and make the best decision he or she can based on the circumstances that are presented in court.
In Wisconsin, where money is not a reason to recuse yourself, and that's a very serious problem. We tried to do as a group of retired judges is say, look, there ought to be some limits and an opportunity to be heard and reviewed if in fact there's been a lot of money in the campaigns. We really spent a long time, and there were some judges that put immense work into this. The court simply and succinctly said no. No hearing, we don't have to look at it again, we don't need to change it.
And the petition was denied without hearing. It's hard to get people to get engaged unless you can promise them something. Judges can only promise to be fair. So we have to be concerned about actual bias, we have to be concerned about appearance of bias. And if we don't do it, if we don't stand up and say, wait a minute, let's look at this again, then who will?
Get to know, some of the integrity as much as you can of the people running for the position and what they're saying. If they're promising things in their election, then they're not going to be impartial.
It's kind of hard to turn around and complain that, well, wait a minute, what's happening with our justice system? I really think people need to pay attention. They need to get out and they need to vote.
What kind of judge do you want sitting in that seat? The kind of person you want is somebody who's fair and just and impartial.
so Jessica's gonna walk us through some money and politics focused on Ohio. I know the mood lighting made you a little sleepy.
No, you really did.
The staff can watch this later.
I made it though. I made it.
Next time we're gonna have chocolate at this moment. Bring that on the agenda.
Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Dickinson, and I had the pleasure of being an intern for Catherine Tercer in Common Cause, Ohio last summer, where I did research on money in judicial elections and judicial reform. My background, I have a law degree from the University of Akron, and I recently completed my master's degree in applied politics. My mother is convinced that I'm a professional student, but I've assured her that I'm on the job. Okay. Anyway, today I am giving an overview of the role money plays in our state Supreme Court here in Ohio, and the threat that this confluence of money in elections poses to the independence and fairness of the court. We think this topic is important because we've seen a steady increase in the amount of money being raised and spent in state judicial elections. For example, every Supreme Court election in Ohio since 2002 has seen at least $3 million in spending. In addition, Ohio has had some of the most expensive Supreme Court races in the country. In 2014, Ohio was ranked 5th out of 39 states on the list of most expensive Supreme Court elections in the country. So there are two broad types of campaign finance at play here. There's money that's disclosed and money that's not disclosed, and money that's not disclosed. Campaign money that's disclosed means it goes directly to the candidate. These funds are required by law to be disclosed, and here in Ohio, those reports are filed with the Ohio Secretary of State's office. They include information such as the amount of money raised and spent by a campaign and who the donors were. And I know some people were talking about accessing that information. That information is available on the Ohio Secretary of State's website, and everybody has access to that. But while this transparency is good, the fact that these funds are being reported doesn't mean that there still isn't a problem. And we see these large amounts of money, and it raises the questions, do judges feel beholden to their campaign contributors and their donors because of that amount of money being spent or raised on their behalf? And in these situations, the judges be required to recuse themselves. We see here in Ohio, Supreme Court justices are allowed to and routinely do sit on cases where their campaign contributors are party to the litigation. On average, we can see out of 403 cases, state Supreme Court justices voted in favor of their contributors 71% of the time. In Ohio, a particular judge, Justice O'Donnell, voted for his contributors over 90% of the time. In looking at 2015 cases, judges recused themselves just 9 times. So they rarely disqualified themselves from those cases with their contributors. With disclosed money, that doesn't tell the whole story. We also need to look at money that's not disclosed, colloquially referred to as dark money. This is money that doesn't go directly to the candidate. Instead, it is spent by outside groups such as super PACs on like TV advertisements in favor of a particular candidate, but not in coordination with the campaign. This money and the donors are not required to be disclosed. So this is perfectly legal. We've mentioned Citizens United several times. That decision ruled that corporations have First Amendment protection, and therefore their funding of political broadcasts and elections cannot be limited, and disclosures of the amounts and the sources is not required. So we see that these expenditures in theory are made independent of a candidate, but in practice we don't really know that that's the case. So this begs the question, if we don't know where the money is coming from, how do we identify the potential conflicts of interest? And if we can identify the conflicts of interest, how do we adequately assess the independence of our court? And again, in these situations should judges be required to recuse themselves. Dark money in campaigns and judicial refusal brings us to another United States Supreme Court case called Caperton versus Massey. This case is a direct example of how outside money and undisclosed money can influence not only a judicial election, but a judge's decision making. But unlike Citizens United, it has a better ending. So this case takes place in our neighboring state of West Virginia. Here we have a small coal company run by a man named Hugh Caperton, and he's essentially being run out of business by a larger coal company, Massey Coal. Caperton is upset, he sues, and he is awarded a $50 million judgment. Massey Coal appeals that judgment. So that's how it starts. So then in between the time of that ruling and the appeals hearing, West Virginia holds a state Supreme Court election. Massey Coal's president, Don Blankenship, knows that this court is going to hear his case. So he decides to spend his money to influence the outcome. So he spends over $500,000 on direct mailings and TV ads in support of a particular candidate, Brent Benjamin. He also formed a super PAC called And for the Sake of the Children. I know he's going to go against the children.
And for the sake of the children.
Where he donated almost $2.5 million in support of Benjamin. So, no surprise, Benjamin gets elected, and Caperton petitions the court for his recusal. Justice Benjamin denies that recusal, and he is part of the 3-2 split that rules in favor of Massey Coal, which overturns that $50 million judgment against them. But we're not done. We head to the Supreme Court, and the court rules here, and I will quote this: when there is a serious risk of bias, of actual bias, when a person with a personal stake in a particular case, Don Blankenship, had a significant and disproportionate influence in placing the judge, or Benjamin, on the case by raising funds or directing the judge's election campaign when the case was pending or imminent. So the court held that Justice Benjamin's interest did in fact impose a risk of actual bias, and he should have recused himself from the case. This ruling requires a judge to recuse himself not only when there is a risk, not only when there's actual bias that can be like shown or proven, but recusal is required when there's also even just a probability of bias. And we can see this same risk of actual bias or probability of bias in our own Supreme Court justices. As we know, they can hear cases from their contributors and they're not required to recuse themselves. So that was my overview. Hopefully this gives you a sense about the kinds of problems that money and state judicial elections can pose. And I will turn now to Catherine.
So I was going to say, one of the things that I think is interesting in that case, and I think one of those things that I think is interesting, we're not talking about money that goes directly to the candidate. You're talking about money that's spent on political advertisement, the money that surrounds the candidate. And so first of all, you have an issue of like, well, you have to know where that money originated, right? So you need to have better disclosure so you can figure out who's actually paying for those ads, so you can figure out, in fact, whether a recusal standard is necessary. So right now we have good disclosure when it comes to the money that goes directly to the candidate, but we don't have great disclosure when it comes to the money surrounding the candidate. The Chamber of Commerce's affiliate, Partnership for Ohio's Future, tends to reveal what they expended, but they don't tell you where that money originated. So that's the kind of thing that has happened in Ohio elections in, like say, the past decade. On that note, yes, do you have a question?
I do. Having been in these
Yes.
circumstances, how do you distinguish, or if you do at all, between the attempt, and I think the West Virginia case is such an extreme example in many ways, fairly clear, of somebody outside actually trying to buy a decision versus a business looking at the candidates in a race that affect their industry and saying, this candidate better reflects my values than this one does. I'm going to support this candidate's candidacy rather than this one because they reflect my values. I'm not looking for an outcome in any particular decision. I'm simply, participating in a way that I can to help see that this person is elected. And we're not talking about necessarily, the outrageous amount that was spent in the West Virginia case, the Cole case.
I think he's really hitting on how do you trigger recusal? What does that actually look like? So you are actually queuing up Trent to talk about what are some of the things that different states actually do. One of the things that I always think about has to do, there are signs, for example, when I think of a case where I was sure that the justice was going to recuse himself, the minute it was very clear that this case was going to go to the Ohio Supreme Court, what happened is this entity, First Energy, basically organized a fundraiser. It was literally, it was very clear it was going to go PUCO. Then within 3 weeks, there was a fundraiser, and it included minor children of the CEO giving. And so at least it triggers questions. And so I'm going to hand it over to my friend Trent Doherty from the Ohio Environmental Council to talk a little bit about what we have as recusal standards for Ohio and what our options are.
Yeah, and it's great tee up there because it's not saying that people should recuse themselves because they receive a campaign contribution, but at least providing Ohio and Ohio's judicial canons, Ohio revised code with the tools so that it's an even playing field. It is understood by everyone what considerations are needed, and that those considerations are there and as transparent as hopefully someday all those contributions are completely transparent. So in Ohio, judges, first and foremost, it's upon themselves through the Code of Judicial Conduct to identify and disclose those areas and those situations in which their impartiality is at least questioned. And it doesn't have to be something that's direct and they know I can't be impartial for this case. Let's say it's because it's their wife or their brother, but it's even in those cases, in those situations where the appearance would lead the reasonable person to feel that they may not be impartial. But it's on the judge to disclose that first and foremost. If the judge doesn't disclose that and recuse himself or herself, the parties to the proceeding can ask that judge to remove themselves. And then again, it's on the judge to make that decision. In a lot of situations, then, if that judge still does not recuse themselves, those parties can file an affidavit to the Ohio Supreme Court for the Supreme Court to ask either that lower court or maybe it's a member of the Ohio Supreme Court to recuse themselves. I've been on the losing end of a couple of those affidavits, trying to get a judge that received campaign contributions from parties in a case that I was in that just so happened that for the first time ever decided to give to a judicial candidate, just so happened to be the same time we had a case. But in those situations in Ohio, then that judge can either, as I said, recuse themselves or not. If it goes up to the next level for the Supreme Court to say, Judge so-and-so, you should recuse yourself, or no, that judge doesn't need to recuse themselves. There doesn't need to be a reason or a stated reason why the judge chose to recuse themselves or that judge chose not to recuse themselves when they were asked to. And I think in both situations, whether a recusal or not, I think it's key to transparency to understand why they decided to recuse themselves or not. that is something that's missing here in Ohio law. As we mentioned, there isn't anything specific in terms of campaign contributions being the trigger for recusal, although in some situations in Ohio it has been the case. There was a situation with the aforementioned Ohio Chamber of Commerce's campaign contributions in which 4 Ohio Supreme Court justices about almost 2 decades ago chose to recuse themselves from a case in which the Chamber of Commerce had given a lot of money to. However, I believe in that. Yeah. Yeah. And then just happened to be during that same court, that same group of folks that were on the court, when they were asked to recuse themselves because of campaign contributions from the aforementioned First Energy, they chose not to recuse themselves, even though the amount of money was still the same amount of money from the same very strong party to a proceeding, didn't recuse themselves. And I think it's because, to your question, is that there aren't any parameters in place to at least give the judges and us as folks that are sort of watching and monitoring and care about these issues. When it comes to campaign contributions, what gets to the level of maybe a reasonable person would think my impartiality is questioned? And you can look to other states. Georgia is one that I look to as a great opportunity to have again a state that's not your far left coast. It's nice smack dab in the South, and utilize them because they have 2 components of their law that I think go straight to the issues that I think are missing in Ohio's, and that is first and foremost, when it comes to campaign contributions, it doesn't say if you receive a campaign contribution, you're out, judge. It gives judges an 8 criteria sort of rubric to follow. And it's in your materials, I think, in your folder, but it gets to, okay, what was the amount of the contribution? What was the timing of the contribution? Catherine brought up the issue with First Energy, just so happened to be right smack dab in the middle between the appeal and the election. It was a perfect time to hold that fundraiser. What is the relationship of the contributor or supporter to the parties? I take that as also being, is there a long-standing history of contributions just based on the fact that I like judges that are pro-environment or pro-social justice. I'm going to make sure I give to them. Or are you in situations that I think I brought up at least twice before that it's the first time 100 or so employees from a certain company decide to perhaps on their own, perhaps encouraged to give to a particular justice in the Ohio Supreme Court one time, and looking to that. And there's that list of 8 criteria. I think putting into Ohio's rules a criteria for judges to follow where it's understood that they can follow this, and to also have it followed going to a different state, going to the state up north in Michigan. Their new rules also require, I believe, not just allow, reasoning behind a decision. If there is again, when I filed my affidavit with Ohio, I didn't get a reason why the judge didn't recuse themselves, or my second attempt that the Supreme Court didn't tell that judge to recuse themselves. They have to actually, in that situation in Michigan, explain why, put it on the table that it was that so-and-so recuse themselves because of perhaps one or a number of those 8 criteria when it comes to campaign contributions, or they decided not to recuse themselves, and explain why and show why they can still be impartial with that concern being put in front of them. And again, I think that's it's not the perfect solution to this. I don't think there actually is a perfect solution, but it's providing the tools within the laws and within the rules to give folks those opportunities. Yes?
Just wanted to correct, I think, one thing.
Correct, yeah.
And I think you're right on the recusal question. But when a party actually decides to file an affidavit of prejudice and demonstrate that they have been prejudiced by, this judge's conduct or actions or decisions in the case, those go to the Chief Justice alone, not to the whole court. And there is a mandatory response in writing from the judge that is required. They do have to put together the reasons and their response to it. The chief judge in nearly all of those does issue a written opinion and makes a decision on whether to take that judge off the case or not. Now, there are times where the court, the chief may contact a judge and say, this is one you probably should take yourself off of. And they do. And, there's no more need for ruling on the affidavit. But nearly all of those that are ruled upon, and that's the vast majority, are ruled upon, are done with a written opinion and a rationale, and those opinions are available publicly like all other court decisions, and they do provide some guidelines for when an affidavit of prejudice would be granted or not. So it's...
Yeah, so when there's, when there has been a decision that one feels that they are prejudiced, versus a situation where I know that I have been involved where it's like, before we get started, and I do get a decision that I hopefully don't like, I want to make sure that it's out and that judge gets the opportunity to take themselves off of the case. Or almost, in situations that I think are also important that I brought up is when there is a recusal that comes out, I think, I'm not going to name the names, but there has been somewhere I've sort of been out of the blue that someone has recused themselves from a case, and the questions pop up in my mind as to why that recusal is there, and having more of an idea of transparency on that end as well as one, and that's a hard one. I think that's sort of beyond where we are, but that's also another thing that jumps into my mind is even when you recuse yourselves, understanding why that recusal is there. I think it all goes to what is most important when it comes to the judiciary is that it is a relationship of trust between the community and the courts, and making sure that everyone has the information on hand to keep that trust as strong as possible is important. And another aspect of this, and just something that I think other states have toyed with, is having an independent body be the one to determine recusal beyond just beyond the judges that may sit above or with those judges that are being questioned on recusal. That's something some other states have used. Sometimes they use their disciplinary committees, but having this sort of outside group to also look into that is another way of, maybe another tool that could be in a toolbox when it comes to looking at this issue of especially money in judicial politics, but ultimately some way to help keep that trust between the community and the courts.
One final item, and that is that the recusal, or asking somebody to recuse, asking a judge to recuse, or carrying on a public campaign to get a judge to recuse, cuts several different ways. There was a great deal of criticism of U.S. Supreme Court Justice Kagan when the Obergefell decision was taken to the court, saying that because she's gay, she can't sit on that case. I've heard of cases where judge had a military background and certain cases came up and there was an outcry. Why should somebody who has a military background and served our country sit on the criminal prosecution of a soldier. You know, and sometimes there's factors here, but sometimes they're really inappropriate considerations or illegal, unconstitutional kinds of discriminations that play into that. So it's, you know, it is tough, as you said, to devise a set of rules or guidelines that will encompass everything.
Yeah, and I think that the issue is one that I think is also cuts into the education factor, the education of folks as to why judges are there, and that especially in the world of fake news, people think there's fake justice as well, and everything is sort of up for I guess opinionated debate. But to giving folks the opportunity to I think get out of their shell of the robe and explain, like, just because a judge is in this particular situation, they can be impartial, even if there is the Justice Kagan one is one of the best examples, because it's the amount of just you know, a horrible campaign against her on that, and I don't think she had a great podium to explain that, because of the sort of shroud of those of the robes that sort of keep a distance between the community and the courts. And I think that's something that we talked about this all day. How do we break that, and how do we find tools? And I think disclosure and recusal, the discussions around those open those doors to that education and that sort of connectedness between the community and the courts that we need. There are obviously others in terms of educating folks on who, why we elect, how we elect. Maybe someday there's a different way of how we get judges in the state, but I think it all goes to this one thing, and that's bridging this unnecessary gap between the communities and the courts.
Well, and I think if the solutions were easy, we would have already done it. And so one of the reasons why we say, okay, what's a model? We have a model in Georgia that we can look at. We can have conversations about what's the best model, but there is a problem. You know, we do not want to have, you know, our judges hearing the cases of their contributors. And you might think, you know, a little bit of money here is one thing, but when you're looking at patterns of giving, it's a problem. And it isn't just a problem because we fear it influences them. It makes us feel fearful about every single decision that's made, because we worry about all sorts of undue influence. So as we think about money in politics, it's worth having a conversation about how best to address this. And it's one of the things that we're going to continue having conversations. That's one of the things that the Ohio Fair Courts Working Group is working on, is how, you know, what is the best solution and what could we do in Ohio? So the last time that I worked on recusal standards related to campaign contributions, the Chief Justice was not Eric Brown. The Chief Justice was Tom Moyer, and I really thought, you know, he had created these like working groups, and I did this thing with the Chamber of Commerce, and we had, you know, all this disclosure stuff, and we also came up with some recommendations related to recusal, and Thomas Moyer, after they had this public process to go over the code of conduct, and what we received back in our petition about recusal standards related to campaign contributions was that in fact there are campaign contribution limits, and because there are campaign contribution limits, that's how we reduce corruption. But that, of course, doesn't take into account, you know, corporations that every, you know, like all sorts of employees and spouses all give. And it doesn't get at just the magnitude of, yes, maybe the contribution limit is a couple $1,000, but then you add all these other people and that amount starts to really add up. And you start to think about, well, how does that actually influence the process? But it's been the conversation about a conversation about withdrawing from a case be triggered by campaign contributions. We haven't had that conversation, as Ohioans in, you know, many, many years. And so I think it's worth having it.
And in the intervening years, what's happened, and I think you mentioned this, is a lot of the money coming into elections isn't going directly to candidates anymore.
That's correct. So since Citizens United, where corporations can in fact spend money on political advertisements, and they do. And that makes an enormous difference. And because the state legislature has not moved to create better disclosure of the kind of spending, that's money that we're not understanding. So we're left a little bit in the dark about who's actually influencing these elections. I did throw up this quote in the PowerPoint because I thought it was worth knowing. This was a decision that came out on Monday, basically saying, hey, you're saying that the rules that are actually in the Code of Conduct, that in fact they are constitutional, that in fact rules that say, hey, you can't campaign with other candidates, and some of the rules about the ways of asking for money that protect the kind of independence of judicial elections, that in fact they are constitutional. And I wanted to highlight this decision because I thought, hey, as we talk about ways to possibly improve more accountability in the courts, we also need to be thinking about like what's actually constitutional. Because there's nothing worse than getting everybody all excited about something and working on it and then being like, oh, sorry, not constitutional. So we will continue to have conversations. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh, there's always something I could add.
Okay.
No, thank you.
So there's so I totally love, Karen called this thing a bicycle rack in the back. So if anybody who wants to add anything, which is basically saying a conversation for another day. Because obviously, we also get to have a training very soon on how to talk about the courts. Any questions or any things that people want to talk about before we move on to, I have a movie for us. It's a short trailer of a movie about dark money.
You know, the number one rule of political or watchdog reporting is follow the money.
John Adams here. I covered the legislature for the Great Falls Tribune.
A source of mine had come across something that I might be interested in. Voters in your district had never seen something.
No, this was a whole new political attack.
They send out all these mailings. They don't care if they lie.
Nobody knows who they are. They call them dark money groups, and that's exactly what they are.
Corporation funnels money to a dark money group. They send out postcards attacking the opponent. When that candidate gets elected, they support the agenda of the corporation.
I don't know how to fight them. I can't pick up the phone and say, hey, what's your interest in candidate X? Because I don't know who they are. And it's not just Montana.
Campaign finance is the gateway to every other issue that you might care about.
Americans are barraged by these political advertisements that are funded by who knows whom. We don't even know if they're domestic.
Politics is just child's play to business. They know how to manipulate the system.
You can buy the politicians, you can buy the judges.
When I first got to the FEC, I thought that we would work together on issues such as disclosure.
If A fails 3-3, motion fails 3-3, F fails 3-3.
The FEC will not enforce the law.
New allegations in court against a leading legislator.
What's at stake is whether or not Art Whittick broke Montana campaign finance laws.
Do we care enough to demand that politicians comply with our campaign laws?
The bottom line is, did Whittick know that he was receiving all of these services?
I'm going to call it like I see it. This man cheated.
The people who want to keep dark money have a real problem. The public does not agree with them.
They want a government that works for them. It doesn't work for special interests, doesn't work for political parties, it works for them.
This is scary stuff, but I think this is the proving ground now for the American experiment.
Anyway, at this point, I'm handing it over to Louise to talk about.
Mr. President, I'd like to take a moment to thank Senator White.
So at this point, I'm handing it to Louise to talk about what can we do with everything that we heard today, and what are the, it'll also, obviously we'll be having many conversations that will follow, but this is a conversation about what can we do.
Yes. So, are we all fired up and ready to roll? Right? I know. It's 1:45. Okay. But as we were planning this forum, we knew that we couldn't just educate and inform. We have to engage and energize, right?
That's right.
And so we have to leave today with a plan and a commitment to carry it out. We have to act, right? So there's a lot to know. Hopefully you learned some things today that you didn't know before. And there are a lot of people involved who are acting, and hopefully you got to know some of the movers and shakers right here around our tables, right? And there's a lot to do. I mean, when you think about what we've talked about, there's so much to do. So where do we start? What can I do? What can you do? What can we do, right? So in your folder is a yellow sheet. Oh, it's not yellow for everybody. Oh dear.
Sorry about that.
It says, oh dear, how to get involved in fair courts, okay?
Wait, does it mean something if you got a yellow one instead of a white one?
Way cooler.
How to get involved.
This title, how to get involved in fair courts.
You got it. How to get involved in fair courts. It's a one-pager, and it has a place in the bottom where you put your name and contact information. So we have some suggestions, and they include become a regional leader or organizational leader, okay? So are you involved in an organization where you come from? Okay. Is there something that you can take from this that you can work with your organization to spread the word and to act, right? That's a question and something that you can think about. If you're not engaged in an organized group like the Democratic Party, isn't that what they say? Then can you become a leader to help to organize or organize organizations to come together on a particular issue, right? That we've dealt with today. How can you inform people about what's going on and to think of action steps? This is not all inclusive, believe me. The next thing is help get the word out. I mean, we've talked to 30 some people today. If every one of us were to talk to how many more, we could multiply the effort, right? Some of us talk. Others of us use digital media and things. Some of us can actually do both. Hard to believe. But think about how you can get the word out. Here's some suggestions. And we're going to get some information after we take a break. So hold on, and we're going to take a break. We're going to get some information just about how we can do messaging, across various media. If you're on social media, how do you take the things that you've gotten today? You have the PowerPoint kind of things, printouts, and they're online somewhere, hopefully.
Yes.
And so you can take one of the things that Catherine did this spring was at the Cleveland International Film Festival. She sponsored with others that Dark Money film and had a panel discussing it afterwards. I hear the room was packed.
Sold out.
Sold out. So that's one possibility, is to take some of the tools and some of the information you've got today and find an exciting way to get the word out, right? Write an op-ed. stand outside your library and distribute flyers. Any of those things. And I know we've got League of Women Voters here. You're used to doing that kind of stuff. So is there something that you can take from today that can be included in your arsenal, if you will, of information that you're distributing? And then how can you support the Fair Courts working groups and very important activities? If we're saying you can help us build or design or update the website, you know, do some things kind of internally to support what's actually going on. So these are some ideas, and I don't know, does anybody have some other ideas of what you could, of what each of us can do individually or what we can do together? Yeah.
What about just, well, first of all, trying to host judge candidate forums and you know, spread the word, get your friends, talk up how important those it is to know about those candidates, and give your friends and your groups opportunities to meet those candidates. But even in certain circumstances, convincing people to run for judge. You may know somebody who's an excellent, informed, engaged with the community, a lawyer who's really never considered that. And maybe that's something that they should think about.
So get to know the candidates that are out there and help to find some more candidates that you would trust, right? It's a matter of trust. Yeah. Anybody else?
Any policy wonks out there? I bet there are folks in this room that might like to be part of a study committee to talk about how, you know, what kind of recusal is best for Ohio, what are the options, have a conversation about where should we go from here. Any of you policy people, please let me know.
And maybe, I don't know, but you know, we're looking at what systems might work better in another state. But maybe we should also look at what systems work in other countries. You know, what are, maybe judges aren't elected, or maybe judges don't sit on cases where they have a conflict of interest, or you know, how are those decisions made, etc. So widen the scope of what you're looking at in terms of possible policies.
So we need to research and then spread the word as we learn more and go deeper into it. Yeah.
Yeah, one idea that may be a bit radical in a group like this, and that is reach out to judges, bar associations, and some other groups that have a different perspective on this, build some relationship, and then try to sit down together to address and discuss and perhaps solve the problem. There can be common understanding on the problem, and there's perhaps ways, because if a group like that comes up with some ideas, they're going to sell far better. They're going to become real in a much better way.
And they're going to buy into it themselves.
Correct. And you know, some of the ideas that you come up with in isolation just might not be realistic. They might not be doable, or there might be information that the lawyers or judges can provide that you just weren't aware of, and even your research might not disclose. So having those relationships and conversations can be valuable.
We're stronger together.
Or as he pointed out, and as that one state moved on, it was the retired judges that moved for reform. So we've got to have those local conversations, find out who has that interest, and then begin to build that conversation, because it was retired judges who worked on the reform.
So there are lots of opportunities for us to take action, and we need to think about who our contacts are, who our relationships are with, who we can have relationships with that we haven't had so far, and how we can actually have an impact. We can have some impact by talking, by learning, by spreading the word, but how can we actually take action that will But anybody who has this sheet, we're asking you to be serious about this and to actually think about which things you can do and put in what other things that if you don't like any of these is fine. But write down or check off what you will do and to leave it with us. And we have made a commitment that for anybody who returns this, somebody will get back in touch with you to see how we can work together to accomplish it, okay? This is also online. You can see it at the bottom. So if you're not quite sure what you want to put on today, please do put your name down and if you want to spread the word. Also go online and you can amend and add and do whatever you want to do online. Okay? I mean, one thing might be that we also, I'm sorry, Karen.
And I captured some of the additional ideas here too.
Excellent.
So you'll get notes.
Excellent. And one thing might be that if it's all right with everybody, that everybody who's registered today, that maybe we could get that list so that we can get back in touch with people to do the work. Okay? Anything else? Any other ideas? It's time for.
And on that note, so the next training is about communication. It's going to take a little time for Nick and Gina to get up here and get themselves all set up. During that time, I encourage you to powder your noses, walk around, wiggle a bit. It'll be a very short break as they're getting themselves set up.
And we have a few more sandwiches if anyone is still hungry.
So the real question isn't about the sandwiches, it's about those cookies.
Having some great